Hello everybody, welcome back to another Patreon tutorial series, and in this one we are going to be painting a koala bear in some trees using watercolours. So here you can see the final painting that we will be working on throughout this tutorial series, and this series is going to be split into 4 different parts. In the first part we're working on the koala, in the second part we're working on the branches, in the third part we're working on the leaves, and then in the final and fourth part we're going to be going in and adding details and highlights. But let's get straight into the first part of this tutorial, which is going to be painting in the koala bear, and I am going to be using a very loose expressive style for this watercolour painting, as I have done for many of my other animal watercolour tutorials on my Patreon. So I'm starting off by mixing up some black watercolour, and I'll leave all of the materials that I'm using in the description below, but you can use any watercolours you have. And I'm using this black watercolour and it's quite opaque. There's just enough water mixed in to get it to flow nicely onto the paper, but really I've kept it as dark as I possibly can because I want to start off by blocking in the darkest areas for the koala. And I'm going to be working on the koala's face first, and then I'll move on to the body. As you can see, I'm blocking in the nose and the eyes first. The sketch outline and the reference are attached for you guys if you want to follow along with this painting. I am using cold pressed watercolour paper for this, as I think cold pressed paper works really well for these loose expressive watercolour techniques compared to hot pressed paper. As you can see, I'm just filling in the nose with that dark black paint. I'm using a round paintbrush to do this. And I'm really taking my time. You want to use the black to fill in all of the darkest areas of the nose, but you don't have to add it everywhere. Make sure that you leave the highlights and any lighter areas of the nose free from any of the black paint. We will add some paint to those areas later on, but it doesn't need to be the black paint. The black paint is only for the darkest areas. So I'm just adding the shadow down the side of that nose, and you can see that I've left a little sort of oval space where there's a bit more of a highlight, where that side of the nose is a little lighter. I'm just going over the closed eyes once again just to darken that up even further, and keep looking around the reference and seeing if there's any other areas on the koala's face that you want to add this really dark paint to. I'm adding it just under the koala's mouth. And I'm using quite a small round brush for this because we are doing the detailed areas, so we want to make sure that we're being really nice and precise. Also, if you don't just want to use black, you can mix in another colour like purple to make it a little more interesting and not just a flat black. So now I'm going in with a bit more water on my brush to get this light grey tone, and I'm using this to paint in areas that are dark and are shadowed but aren't quite black, because we want to get a variety of values in our painting. So if you want to get a lighter value of a specific colour, just mix in more water to get a lighter wash. So I've got a bit more water on my brush. I'm just bleeding out those dark areas to create a lighter gradient. And the more water you add, the lighter your wash of colour will be. So I'm just working on the koala's hand that's next to his face. I'm also tapping in some darker black, and because that light wash is still wet, it will bleed out and give us a wet on wet technique look to this area. Now I'm going further up on the koala and I'm adding some dark black paint to the ear, to the shadowed parts of the ear. And I start off by blocking in the darkest areas first with this piece. So now that we've pretty much finished this little section, we've added in the really dark values and we've got some lighter washes. Whilst this is still wet, I do want to drop in some other colours so that it can bleed out and give us that wet on wet technique. So I'm just tapping in a little bit of purple into those light washes of grey and also on top of the black as well, just to make it more interesting and colourful. You don't have to use purple for this, but I do recommend that colour. I think it works really well with dark coloured fur. But you could also use a blue. I'm also using that light wash of purple to fill in that highlight on the nose. And I'm adding a more intense purple right on the edge where the black meets that highlight to give it more of a gradual transition. I'm now mixing up some blue and I'm going to tap in a little bit of blue as well. Once again to add even more colours to the painting and give it even more of an interesting look. And at the moment I'm just tapping these colours into the areas that we've already worked on where the paint is still wet. You can go back in with your black if you need to darken up the darkest shadows a bit more. Make sure that you're not painting in everywhere as well. Try and leave some areas white, as this really helps to add to the contrast. With a loose expressive style, you definitely don't need to add watercolour everywhere. You can leave little gaps for highlights, even if that area isn't really bright white in the reference. Now I'm going to move on to the next section of the koala, and I'm working on the other eye. I'm getting a very light wash of, it's kind of like a grey mixed with the purple, because I had a bit of black and purple left on my brush. And I'm just adding a light wash around the koala's eye. I'm blending that purple wash further down onto the koala's cheek and connecting it to the nose, creating that little line in the mouth. I'm using this light wash of colour to get those key lines blocked in, like the mouth. I'm also creating a tapping motion to give the look of short fur just above the nose. And because I haven't got much paint on my brush and because I'm using a cold pressed paper, it means that it's kind of like the dry brushing method where you'll see some of the paper texture showing through, because we haven't got much paint on our brush, and this will help give us the look of fur as well, as it skips over some of the grooves in the paper. It gives more of a grainy look, which is helpful for really short spiky fur. You can see that I'm still working with light washes at the moment. Then I will tap in some darker colours to darken it up and add more shading. Picking up a bit more purple, going over the left eye, and just adding a few details above the nose. With an expressive painting, you don't have to focus loads on detail. It's important to get some detail in to give the look of a realistic texture, to make it more interesting and make it look like the animal, but you don't have to be super focused on the details because you're not trying to make it photorealistic. So just get the sort of impression of the different textures and detail in there, but you don't have to go overboard and focus on details. I'm adding a bit of black where we've done the line for the mouth. And I'm adding some of that darker black just under that right eye as well. You can see that it's bleeding into that light wash of purple. And so I'm just looking at the reference and I'm picking out these darker areas. And that's how I decide where I want to darken up a bit more. I'll keep adding more darker paint until I've got it a close value to the reference. Because even though you're doing something that's expressive, you still want to get your values accurate so that the painting pops. The only thing you don't really need to focus on is having super accurate colours to the reference and having a lot of detail. I'm going to tap in some more purple, just like we did with the first part. And I'm also going to do the same thing with the blue again. So you can see how I'm repeating the same process for each area. Adding a bit more water to make that blue a little more subtle, and I'm spreading it further up the koala's head. Tapping in a little bit of black as well. And I do like to keep like the eyes and the nose and the centre of the face quite sort of defined. And then as we get further out of the koala, I do get a little bit looser like I am with the head now. I'm tapping in some darker black to get in those shadows on the head. And you can see in the reference at the top of the koala's head, there's quite a bright sort of highlight on the top of the koala's head. So I'm not going to be adding much watercolour, if any, to the top, right at the top of the koala's head, but I'll be using the leaves in the background and the greenery in the background to create a contrast between the top of the head and the background so that we will be able to see the shape of the koala's head properly. So if you look just above the nose, you can see that using that dry brushing technique has helped to add some texture. And you can even go in and add something like salt to help give more of an interesting effect as well. So if you was to sprinkle a little bit of salt above the nose, then you can get a snowy sort of, it looks really good for things like fur as well. But you have to do it whilst that area is still wet. Now I'm going back in with the really dark black and I'm working on the intense shadows for the top of the head. I'm going down towards the ear and getting in those shadows. And you can see that when I'm painting in the shadows for the ear, I've used little lines and I'm going in that specific direction to help give that ear a realistic texture. So because the ear has got longer fur than the koala's face, I want to be doing longer brush strokes, doing them in lines to make it look like it's fur, even though I'm not doing loads of details. I'm doing the same thing again, getting in those lighter washes of the black by adding in more water. Again, doing a few lines to indicate fur on the ear. And I'm going to be going in with my colours again, with the purple and the blue, over the top of those lighter washes and over the black, to once again make it more interesting and a pretty colour. And I'm quite random with where I want to place this. I haven't like planned it out. It's just where I feel like I want a pop of purple. So you don't have to be really, really strict. And if you're thinking, well, how do I know where I'm going to put the purple and where I'm going to put the blue? I don't have it all planned out. I just go in with the purple and I tap it in areas where I think it would look good, and I try and spread it out, and then I go in with the blue and I add that to any areas that are lacking a bit of colour. And I don't go overboard with the purple. You can see that I'm adding a few pops of it here and there, but you can still see some of the grey and you can still see some of the white of the paper. I'm not covering everything up, just add it a little bit. Also adding a bit more black into that lighter wash. And like I said, I'm not going to add too much paint right at the top of the koala's head, because that area is very highlighted. I'm really happy with how the face is looking at the moment. I think it's looking really nice and expressive. You can tell it's a koala, well, you can start to tell that it's a koala, but there's no sort of heavy detail. We've got a few lines for the ear to help give the look of a furry ear, but everything is pretty simple, and I really like the bled out look of the washes of watercolour where they're bleeding into each other. And you can run a clean brush over a darker area, like I did with the shadows on the ear, and it will start to run and bleed a bit into the lighter washes. So now you can see that the mouth of the koala has got a bit more of a pinky flesh tinge. So I'm mixing up some pink with a little bit of brown just to mute it a bit so it's not just hot pink. And I'm just going to lightly add that over the top of the mouth to give that a bit more of a pop of colour. And I'm also going to add it a little bit above and below the eye, and just a little bit throughout the middle. And you can see that even though I'm using it heavily around the mouth, I do like to put it in a couple of other areas, just so that the colours are spread out throughout the piece. So now look at your piece and see if there's anything that you want to tweak. Is there any areas that need to go darker? Like for me, the middle of the koala's face, I felt like that fur needed to be a bit darker, so I added in a bit more black, and I'm going to go over with a bit more purple as well. And I just want to deepen it up to create a better contrast. I'm really happy with how this is looking. I hope you guys are happy with how yours are looking. And try and analyse your own painting, because I may be tweaking things that you might already be happy with. So look at the face of your koala, and is there anything that you want to adjust? Is there any areas that are too dark? You can use a clean damp brush to lift up watercolour. Make sure it's not a wet brush, make sure it's just damp. Or you could use tissue to lift up wet watercolour as well, if you want to get an area lighter. Now I'm going back in with the black, and I'm just going over some of those darkest shadows, like the eyes. As the watercolour starts to dry, you may notice the areas are drying lighter than they look when they are wet, and that's a pretty common property of watercolours. They do tend to dry sometimes a bit lighter than they look when they're wet, and so you may think that your painting is dark enough, you've got a great contrast, but as it starts to dry, the contrast goes away and the dark areas actually look a bit lighter than they should be. So always make sure that you're going in with more and more layers just to make sure it's as dark as it needs to be, like I'm doing with the ear and with the eyes and with the nose as well. Adding a bit more shadow throughout the middle of the koala's face. But now I'm just going to spend a few minutes tweaking that before I move on to the next part. Now we're going to move on to painting in the body of the koala, and the body is going to be a lot more loose and expressive. So I'm starting off with my black paint yet again, and I'm going to be using the same colours for the body, and I'm starting off by painting in the little bit of the body that we can see, this little section of the body which has got the leg and the koala's arm overlapping it, so it's actually very dark. And that's why I'm painting it in just using the black, because this part of the body is in a lot of shadow as it's got the arm and the leg wrapping around it, and therefore limiting the light that that part of the body can get. I'm carefully painting in this area, as you can see, creating a nice cut-off point where the leg and the arm starts, and I'm just filling in the whole of that section with the black paint. I'm looking back and forth between the reference and the painting. And now I'm taking the purple and I'm using this to paint in the shadows on the arm. So I'm mainly adding this to the lower half of the arm, and I'm not touching it yet to that black because I don't want them to bleed into each other. So I'm leaving that little gap. You can see that I'm being very loose, and now I'm pulling some of that darker black to mix with the lighter wash of purple further up the arm. Tapping in a little bit of black into the purple to create the shadows on the arm and intensifying it even more. You can see how I'm being very loose with the body, even more than I was with the face. Tapping in some more purple to darken it up while still giving that colourful look to the painting. I'm using quite a strong purple now, and I'm just mapping in some of the shadows for the ear, for the koala's ear. And you can see that I'm jumping around quite a lot with the painting as I notice an area that is quite dark. What I do a lot when I'm doing these kind of paintings is you'll see that I pause quite a bit. And that is because I'm deciding where I want to apply these colours, because even though it's expressive and loose, you have got to be a little bit calculated about it. So before I add a colour or a wash to any area, I think about what I want it to look like, because I want it to be very loose and expressive, but also quite intentional as well. So always think about what you want to do before you do it. Now I'm going to go for some cauliflower effects. So you can see that I'm dropping in some clean water onto some of the darker areas, particularly on the koala's arm. And that is because I want these cauliflower effects that you'll start to see forming as this enhances that loose expressive style. And I always like to add them throughout the darkest areas of a painting because that's where they are the most pronounced and where they stand out the most. Now I'm working on the koala's leg, trying to block in the shadows. I'm really not focusing on any sort of detail throughout the body of the koala. It's just about blocking in values. I'm going in first with the purple, and you can see that I've got pretty much a light wash going on, and I'm adding this everywhere but certain areas that I want to leave white, and they are normally the brightest parts of that area. Even areas that aren't white in the reference, I will leave them white in the painting. So I just leave the lightest areas in each area white. You can see that I'm now tapping in some darker shadows to darken up the leg even more. And I'm also adding some shadow throughout the bottom of the koala. You can see how the body is very loose and expressive, but you can still tell what each element is. You can still tell that we've got the arm there, and we've got the leg, and the shape of the koala. Adding in some more black, especially just below the koala's face, because the koala's face is going to be casting a shadow onto that arm, onto the body. Just darkening up the shadows on the leg a bit more. I'm doing a few little lines to indicate the look of fur. Once again, you can see that I'm pausing so that I'm very intentional about where I'm applying that black, because it's very difficult to remove black paint completely. Now what I'm doing is I'm outlining the branch. So I'm painting in a little bit of the branch just to give the highlight around the arm so that we can kind of suss out how everything looks, because at the moment the highlights of the leg and of the arm were just sort of mixing in with the branch, but the branch is going to be a lot darker. So I'm just adding in those outlines so that we could see what the foot looked like and what the arm looked like. I'm continuing to add some light washes of grey to build up the back of the koala. You can see that now that the face has started to dry, it's not as sort of vibrant and dark as it looked in the reference. So it may look unbalanced, but when the body dries, it will match the face. So you can see that I just used a bit of tissue to lift up bits of wet watercolour that I didn't like the look of. Adding a bit more purple to the back of the koala. I'm just going to define the bottom of the koala's body a little bit more. Just using the purple for the moment. We will be adding in a little bit of blue as well, just like we did with the face, because I like to use the same colours throughout the piece. I don't just like to use a blue for the face and then not incorporate it anywhere in the body when they're technically the same colour in the reference. So I will be mixing in a little bit of blue throughout the body as well. I'm adding some more black over the top of that purple for the bottom of the body. And we haven't got too much left to do with the koala. Just adding some more details and shadows to the leg and the sort of joints between the foot and the leg, that crease. So there's a few leaves that are overlapping onto the koala's ear, onto the koala's body. So you can see that I've left those areas white because we'll be filling those in with the green later on. So make sure that you leave the leaves white for now. Let's go in with that blue and just tap that throughout the body. Like I said, I do this very randomly. I'm going to add a bit throughout the arm. And like I said earlier, you can incorporate the blue and the purple on top of the really dark black areas so that they don't look as flat. So once again, I'm just going to continue to build up a few more shadows until I'm happy with the contrast throughout the body and until I feel like it matches with the contrast in the face. And then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next step. So as you can see, I've added a bit more shadow and definition to the koala. And so now that we've worked on this part, we can move on to the next part where we're going to be working on painting in the branches. And so the main tree trunks that the koala is on. So I'll see you guys in the next part. Bye everybody. Hey everybody, welcome back to the second part in this painting series. So now we are going to start painting the branches, and I'm starting off by painting the left hand side branch. And I'm going to be using a larger paintbrush for this mainly because we're going to be painting a larger area. And you can see that I'm going in firstly with quite an intense amount of purple, and it's very intense in colour. I haven't got a load of water mixed in, so it's not a really light wash. It's still very concentrated, very pigmented, and it looks really nice and vibrant. And you can see that I'm just spreading this on the left hand side of this branch or tree trunk. I'm not really sure which it is. I'm gonna call it a branch. And you can see that I've got quite a dark intense amount of it at the bottom, and now I'm going to go lighter by mixing in a bit more water as we go further up and to the right hand side of the branch. So I wanted to start off with a really nice colourful base, and I will be dotting in other colours like this black to darken it up and intensify it even more, especially where the darkest areas are, but I did want to start off with a really nice pop of colour. So I'm adding the black where the shadows are for this tree trunk, for this branch, and most of the shadows are down the bottom to start off with. So you can see that I'm adding some black throughout the branch, and I'm doing it in lines that are going with the sort of curvature and the curve of the tree trunk to add some sort of texture in there. So I'm trying to add these little lines, and I'm doing these tapping motions as well to give more of a textured look to the branches, because it's wood and it's going to have like bits of bark on it, and it's going to have a rougher texture. So I didn't want to do it all really smooth and silky. I wanted to add some little lines and do a tapping motion to make it look a bit more textured. You can see that I'm intensifying the shadows even more with some more black. This time there's a lot less water mixed in to really darken up those shadows and give a really nice contrast. And make sure you switch the brush that you're using depending on the area you're working on. If you're working on a really small detailed area, then use a really small brush. And if you're doing a larger area, then switch to a larger brush. And I know that may sound like obvious and like common sense, but if you try and do a large area with a small brush, not only is it going to take you more time to do, but it's harder to get really nice smooth transitions and to add a nice even wash of colour. So use the appropriate brush for the specific area you're doing. Otherwise the techniques and effects that you're using might not come out how you want them to. So now that we've added in the purple and the black for the shadows, let's add in some other colours that we haven't used yet. So I'm going to be using some orange. Trees have got more of a brown, well they're brown, they've got browns in them, they've got greens. So I like to use colours that are similar to the browns, and when I think of browns I think of reds and oranges as well. So I'm tapping in some orange. And I'm not adding too much orange on top of the purple, because if those colours mix too much, they can become very dirty and muddy looking. So I'm trying to avoid adding too much orange directly over the top of the purple. I will add some orange further up on the branch where we haven't added any colour yet. I'm also adding a bit more purple on the left hand side of the branch, just to make it more vibrant and more intense, because you may notice that it's going to dry lighter than you want it to and less saturated than you want it to. So if you have sort of an inkling that it's not going to look how you want it to when it's dried, because it does dry lighter than it looks when it's wet, then go in and add a bit more of the colour that you want to pop more. You can see that I also mixed in a little bit of green for the top of the branch. I'm going back in with my orange and I'm going to add that to the right hand side and throughout the middle of that tree trunk as well. And you can see that I'm just loosely tapping in these different colours to fill in this branch. Mainly the orange and the green at the top and the purple and the black towards the bottom. Tapping a bit more green, make it more vibrant and colourful. A bit more purple up the left hand side. Now to create some of those cauliflower effects like we did for the koala, I'm going in with some of that clean water again and I'm just tapping that into some of those darker areas. And I'm also lifting up some highlights further down the branch by using a clean damp brush. And as you can see, it lifts up that wet watercolour to give us a really nice highlight. Like I said, to do this you need a clean damp brush. You don't want your brush to be wet, otherwise you will get those cauliflower effects. If you just want to lift the paint, then you just want it to be damp so it can absorb that paint. If it's too wet, it won't be able to absorb and lift that watercolour up. You can see that I added some really pigmented orange in there, which really pops and stands out. And I'm going to add some more green, and this is like a greeny blue. You can do a bit of tapping with the paint to create little splatters if you want to. I want to keep this really nice and loose. So now it's time just to darken up some of the shadows a bit more. So I'm just going in with a little more black. And I'm just looking at the reference and adding the black anywhere where I feel needs to go darker. And for the darkest areas. Mainly I'm working it throughout the bottom of the branch and also up the left hand side. Once again, analyse your painting because you may need to add it to different areas that I don't, and you may have already got areas dark enough that I'm adding more paint to. You can see I'm also doing a few of those lines again to create more of a texture to the branch. So continue just to tweak your painting, lift up areas that you want to be lighter with the tissue and go in with those darker paints to add some more shadows. So one thing that I do want to do is start to bleed out some of the edges to create more of a bled out look from the branch into the background. So I'm just taking clean water on my brush and you can see that I just pulled the edge of that branch and some of that colour has bled out into that lighter wash, as you can see. I'm going to clean off my brush again. And if there's any areas where it didn't turn out how you liked it to, you can dab it with some tissue and then go over it with a clean brush. And I'm also adding some other colours like the pink. And I like doing this because I like to have a variety of really harsh, clean edges and also softer, more bled out, blurry edges as well. So some areas of the tree trunk you can see is very crisp, and then other areas like the left hand side of this branch you can see bleeds out a bit more. Adding some purple. Once again, this just helps to make it look more interesting because you're using different techniques in that area, and it really helps to give that expressive look that you're going for. So I'm just adding a bit more shadow to the edge so that it maintains its really dark value. and it will continue to bleed out into that wet surface. So I know that I did that step quite quick. I'm very quick when I do that, but take your time so that you get it how you want it to. You may have to go and re-watch that part. And you can see from this angle that it creates that really nice soft edge to the branch, which complements those harsh edges and defined edges really nicely. So now I'm working on the little bit of the branch that we can see. We can see this branch from a different angle, and this is directly below the koala bear. It's the one that is sitting on. And so once again, I'm going in with that purple, just like we did with the first branch, and I'm just creating that base wash, creating this really nice vibrant wash of colours. Remember, you don't have to paint in every single part of the branch if you don't want to. If there's some highlights that you want to leave white, then go ahead and do that. Now I'm going to mix up more of a browny tone with some yellow, and I'm going to use this to create the front of the log. So basically we can see the front of the log inside rather than too much of the side. We can see it straight on. So I'm just painting in the center with more browns and yellows. Add some black as well for the darkest shadows over the top of that purple. But I'm not going to add too much detail to this branch. I'm going to keep it quite minimalistic. So now on the right hand side of the branch it's quite dark, so I'm going straight in with some really dark brown and purple paint mixed together. I'm just getting in that shadow, mixing in some black as well to darken it up even more. And so this is a place where you may want to go in and add in like a cauliflower effect by dropping in some clean water into these shadows. It's completely up to you where you want to add in different effects. I'm adding in the shadow on the other side. You can go over it with the tissue if you want to lift up any highlights within the shadows. Now I'm going to add a bit more of that orange to the branch. So remember, I like to incorporate the colours that we've used for the other branch into all of the branches. I've added quite a lot of orange to this one. I'm also going to add a little more orange to the other branch as well. You can see that I used more of a splattering motion when I did that. Doing the same thing with the green again. Once again doing that tapping motion on the brush to give the look of splatters. And I'm tapping in a bit more water within the darker area of the branch to give that cauliflower effect, which will also help to add texture to the branch. I'm also going in with my tissue and just using that to lift up some areas of highlight. You can do this in any areas where you feel have gone a bit too dark. And once again, I'm just adding a bit more purple. Now I'm going over to the next branch and I'm just adding a light wash of a purpley black tone, adding some shadows with the black. You can see that I'm doing this very quickly and loosely. Adding in a bit more purple. And there's not that much we need to do to this branch. I'm just going to tap in a bit of the green, just like we did with the other one, to match these colours up. And I'm creating a few little splatters. Just going to blend them out with a clean brush. And you can do that if you don't like how any of your splatters look. You can simply just blend over them with a brush and then even lift them up with a tissue if you want to. I'm going to create some highlights in this branch with that clean damp brush. I find that the tissue gives you more of a harsh edge, but using a clean damp brush maintains that nice smooth wet and wet technique a bit better. So I'm just going to tweak this branch until I'm happy with it, and then I'll move on to the final branch. With the next branch, I am starting off by using the black paint this time. And I'm very neatly outlining the branch, the tree trunk. I'm working on the left-hand side of the trunk at the moment. Just carefully working my brush around where those leaves are going to be. I'm going further up the trunk now and continuing with that outline. Being very careful that I don't add any black where it shouldn't be. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the bottom of the tree trunk, once again being careful to go around the edge of the koala bear. Once again, you can see that I'm going in these vertical lines to help give more texture to the branch. And now I'm going in and adding a lighter wash on the right hand side, mixing in a bit more water to create a larger range of values. I'm skipping over certain areas to leave some natural highlights, some white of the paper showing through. And I'm just intensifying those shadows even more with some darker black. Once again, you could have done the same thing by going in with your wash of purple and then tap in the black. I suppose I just felt like doing something a little different, and with an expressive piece, it's not like you have to follow lots of strict rules. You can have fun with it and just do what you want, what you feel like doing with each area. So that's why you may see me changing the colours I'm using. It's not because there's any massive reason why you need to do it that way. It's probably just because I fancied a change and maybe I had that colour mixed up and I just thought I'd use that first. So once again, let's go back in and do those little tapping motions and those vertical lines to give us that effect of wood on the tree trunk. I'm really loving how this piece is looking. Let's go in with a bit of the green. Once again, I'm working that throughout the top of the tree trunk, intensifying it even more with some more concentrated green. And this time, this green is a bit more yellowy toned than bluey toned. Also, another thing is you don't have to use these exact colours that I'm using. This is really loose. You can use whatever shades of green you want, whatever shades of purple, orange, it really doesn't matter. With this type of painting, you don't have to get realistic and really accurate colours. What matters more is focusing on the contrast, getting in those dark values. But honestly, you don't need to use the exact colours. I don't even know the names of the exact colours that I'm using. I just pick ones from the pan that I like the look of and then I drop them in there. So I'm adding a really neon vibrant green to the tree trunk now. And tapping some green in. Now I'm going in with the purple to create some of the shadows, especially within that green area at the top because that's still really light. So I'm just going to add the purple a bit further up, continuing to apply the purple in the same way that I did with the other colours, using lines and a tapping technique. Next, I'm going to add in some orange as well. Just tapping this over the top of the green, just randomly throughout the tree trunk. Also adding a little more of a red colour as well. And I'm going in with a little bit of black and just adding in some shadows, particularly on the left hand side at the top here. Next, I'm going in with some clean water on my brush and I'm just tapping this over the branches, over the tree trunk, to give a cool texture, a cool, interesting little cauliflower effect. And I also want to go in and add a bit more shadow to this bottom branch. There we go, just intensify that a bit more. And that is pretty much it for these branches. You can see that they are very loose and expressive, but you can still tell that they are tree trunks. They're very colourful. We've got some different effects going on. We've got lots of different colours in there, and they've still got a bumpy look to them. They're not super smooth. And yeah, I hope you like how your painting is looking so far. In the next part, we're going to be working on the background. We're going to be adding in all of the leaves and the foliage in the background. And then we'll just be moving on after that to adding in any details and highlights. I'm just finishing off by going in with the tissue and just lifting up some areas to create more of a highlight, and also mainly to add in a bit more texture to the tree trunks, to give them more of that rough wooden texture to them. But that is pretty much it for this part, and now let's move on to painting the leaves and the background. So I'll see you guys in the next part. Bye everybody. Welcome back to the third part of this tutorial series. In this part, we're going to be focusing on painting in the leaves and in the background for this koala painting. I'm starting off with a really light, vibrant green tone, and you can see that I'm starting to paint in leaves and stems in the trees. So I'm doing long strokes and also little oval motions for leaves. And you can see that I'm actually not putting in too much detail. I'm just blocking in the general shape of what leaves and stems would be. So I'm doing a lot of little lines and also ovals as well. And just those leaf shapes, but I'm not adding in any veins on the leaves or any details. And I'm just looking at the reference to get a general idea of where the leaves are, how many are there in each area, which areas have got the most leaves and stuff like that. But I'm just trying to give the impression that there's leaves and stems and foliage in the background, but I don't want it to be super realistic because it's also not the main focal point that I want this painting to be of. I want the focal point to be the koala, so I'm just getting in some general leaf shapes. I'm now going in with a bit of a darker green, and I'm just adding that to the top left hand corner just to add a little bit of shadow to that area. Now I'm going to move on and continue to add some of those leaf shapes throughout the next part of the painting. So I'm working on the section above the koala's head, and remember earlier where I said that I was going to be using the darker green and some green tones to outline the koala's head, because obviously the top of the koala is very white. Well, that's what I'm going to be doing in a minute to that area. I also just went back in with those darker greens and added some more of those darker greens further down the left hand side of that painting, just to add a bit of contrast to the background. So now I'm going in with that lighter green and I'm doing some wispy lines to create those little stems. And I'll also start to create some leaf shapes as well. Remember, you don't have to paint in every single part of the background. You can leave areas white. I'm building up another layer of those little leaves and stems. And I'm just using a dark, well, not necessarily a dark green, but a more pigmented green for this, so that these shapes stand out more. Again, I'm continuing to do the round shapes for the leaves. And if there's any leaves that are a bit darker, you can go in with a darker green to block them in. You can use a variety of greens when doing this and a variety of different values of greens. So don't feel like you have to stick to one paint. You can go for darker greens, lighter or darker washes. You can get in a variety if you want to. So I just filled in the leaves that are overlapping with the koala. Just tapping a bit of green into those areas. I'm also adding a little bit of purple just by the edge of the branch because I want to bleed that into the leaves a little bit. I'm also adding in a little bit of blue. Some more pigmented blue. And some purple. I'm also creating some splatters to give even more of a loose effect. So I wanted to get a similar effect to what we did with the other branch where we had that bleed out in that small middle area of the tree trunk. I'm also going to go back to the tree trunk and just add in a few lines using that black paint just to create some more texture to the trunk. But if you're happy with how your branches are looking, then you don't have to do this step. It's just if you want to add a bit more texture. Next I'm going in with a darker green and I'm just going to outline some of the leaves. You can add a little detail to a couple of leaves if you want. For example, a little line down the middle to create the middle vein. And I'm also using the darker green to add in some darker leaves. So adding in another layer of the leaves. I'm starting off by working on all of the leaves that are touching the koala. And then I'm moving on to the section above the koala's head. So now I want to create a contrast between the background and the top of the koala's head. So as you can see, I'm taking that darker green and I'm just using that to outline the top of the koala's head, because before we couldn't see where the koala's head stopped because it was highlighted, so it was white like the paper, whereas now we can see the clear shape of the koala's head. So I started off with quite a light wash, but you can go in and tap in some darker, more pigmented greens to create even more contrast. I'm going in with a really neon vibrant green first. And then I'm going in with a dark green to make the koala really pop by giving a much higher contrast. Now I'm going to go in with that same dark green and just use that to add in a few more lines and circles to create leaf shapes and foliage. Once again, I'm going to move on to the next area and repeat the exact same process, starting off with that really light green and going in and blocking in the leaves. So once again, I'm looking loosely at the reference image, but you don't have to do it exactly like the reference. You can put your leaves in wherever you want. I recommend having a range of sizes and try and make the shapes a little bit different so that they're not all uniformed. I'm just going to continue throughout this thin section and just block in some leaves. Once you've finished adding in all of the leaves that you want to with that lighter green, you can start to move on adding in some darker shadows and some darker leaves using that darker green that we've been using for the other areas. So you can use this in between those lighter greens to create shadow behind them, or you can use them to paint in other leaves. So you can see that I'm adding it a little bit in between the leaves. This also helps the leaves to stand out a bit more. So I'm filling in gaps between the leaves that look more shadowed in the reference image. And like I said, you can also use it to loosely block in the shape of the darker leaves as well. So just like I did with the lighter green, I'm going to repeat the same process of just going throughout this section and blocking in some shadows and some leaves using this darker green tone. And then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next step. The last thing that I'm doing with this section is I'm just going in with a little bit of black, and I'm mixed in that darker green with the black. You can do that if you want it to look a little more natural, and I'm just tapping a little bit of this black in between the leaves to give a natural looking shadow. You can see this little section that we've done is very loose and expressive, and a lot of the different areas are bleeding into each other. So you don't have to be too precise when you're getting in your shadows, because it's all looking very loose and expressive anyway. And now we've pretty much done with that section, so let's move on to the next part. The next thing that I wanted to do was go back over the first area that we painted in on the background and just add a bit more detail, because I feel like this section didn't have many loose individual leaves. It was mainly just a light wash of green all over. So I'm starting off with the bottom part of that section, just adding in some darker leaves and some darker foliage using a darker green. Once again, still keeping it very loose and simple shapes, but just adding more layers of them at the bottom. I also want to darken up the left hand side of the background, so I'm pre-wetting the whole of that middle area just using some water, and I will be going in and dropping in some darker greens to give more contrast to this area of the background. So I'm working right to the edge and just tapping in some dark green. I'm just looking at the reference, seeing what else I want to add in. Remember, if there's anything that you don't like the look of, you can always just blot it with a bit of tissue. I also added in some purple to the top left corner and just blended it out a little bit with some of the, well, with the clean damp brush. And I'm going back in with that darker green and just building up another layer. Next, I'm going to start to add in some colourful splatters. I'm going to actually start off by using some yellow paint, as I think this will be a really nice contribution to this painting, a bit of yellow. And you can see that I'm just going all around the painting and I'm just adding some splatters by tapping on the back of my brush. I'm also adding a few wisps throughout the foliage, throughout the background, just to add a pop of colour to the greenery. I find that a yellow colour always goes nice added into some green. I'm also adding a bit of yellow to the branch. To the end of this tree trunk. Yellow can be quite it can really overtake in the painting, so try not to use too much of it. Otherwise it may be too distracting. I'm also going in with some pink and adding some pink splatters. And you can use the colours that you've already used to then go and add splatters. That's what I tend to do. Like I'll go in with the purple and the greens and the pinks and the oranges and go in and add in splatters with all of those colours that I've been using. Now if you want bigger splatters, then use a bigger paintbrush. If you want small splatters, then use a smaller paintbrush. Like I said, I'm now going in with some of the orange and I'm just repeating the same process. So do this process and add splatters using as many of the colours as you want to use. Just before we call the background portion of this painting finished, I am going to go back in with that darker green and just go throughout the background and add in some darker foliage and some darker leaves and some details to the main leaves, for example, outlining them a little bit and adding in potentially a couple of veins, but mainly adding in these smaller details and just defining some of the main leaves a little bit more, especially in areas where the leaves have become very bled out. So have a look at your painting and see which leaves you want to make stand out a bit more and which leaves you want to make a bit darker. So I'm just going to spend a minute just adding some more shadows. Okay, so that is it for this third part, and in the fourth and final part we're just going to finish up this painting with a few more details and some highlights. So I'll see you guys in the last part. Bye everybody. Hey everybody, welcome back to the last part of this tutorial series, and in this part I'm just going to add some final details and highlights to this painting. And now this is where the style of this painting for me is going to change a little, because I am going to be doing some outlining, as you can see, using my fine liner. And so if you like how yours looks and you want it to look really loose and expressive, then you can stop your painting now. You don't have to do this last part, and especially this little part here, you don't have to go in with a pen and outline your koala at all. So this is just something that I wanted to do with my piece, but you definitely don't have to do that for yours. It will just give you a different look depending on whether you do use the pen or whether you don't. So I'm going in with a small fine liner, and I think this was a Faber-Castell Pitt Artist pen. And I'm just going in and I'm just adding a bit of definition, as you can see, to the top of the koala's head, the eyes, the nose, the mouth. I'm just defining those areas a little bit more. I'm also going to use this pen to just add a bit more definition to the sides of the branches, to add a bit more texture to the branches, and that's all I'm really going to be using this pen for. Now, like I said, you definitely don't have to do this step. I know quite a few of you may prefer it before I do these details and these few highlights, because it's just a preference in style. And you will see me swapping back to the watercolours if I notice something that I want to tweak. An area where I want to add a bit more green, like there I missed out a leaf, so I wanted to add a bit of green. But mainly I'm just focusing on outlining and crispening up the edges, firstly for the main parts of the koala. You can also use the pen to add a few details, like a few fur markings on the koala, on the body, on the koala's face. So you can add a few lines to indicate the look of fur, especially on the ear where the fur is longer. There's not really much to say about this part, because I'm just going through all of the main parts of the koala, like the arm, the leg, the head, the nose, and just outlining them and making sure that they pop. As you can see, I was doing a few little lines to add a bit more of an interesting texture to the koala. So I'm just going to spend the next few minutes working on outlining and defining the koala a bit more. Now that we've pretty much worked on defining the koala, it's time to move on to the branches. So I'm going to start to add a bit more detail and definition to the tree trunks. And I'm going to be starting off with the trunk on the right hand side. And I'm first going in and just adding some really sketchy lines for the outside of the trunk. Swapping over to this branch at the bottom, And you can see that I'm adding in some sketchy lines throughout the log, throughout the bark. Moving back to the main tree trunk on the right, and you can see that I'm doing very sketchy lines because I want it to look really rough. I want the wood to look rough and textured. And I'm doing all of my lines vertically. I'm looking at the reference to see where the most texture is in the tree trunk. And I'm going to continue to outline the right hand side of this tree trunk. And I'm going to repeat this process of outlining the branches and the tree trunks and adding in texture throughout the tree trunk. I'm going to repeat this same thing that I'm doing throughout all of the branches. Now that I've finished adding some of the details and lines to the tree trunks using the fine liner, I decided that I wanted to go in and actually add in some more black watercolour to darken up a few areas of the tree trunks even more. So I'm going in with my small round brush and I'm just working on adding in some more lines and some more shadows using the black paint. I'm starting off with the tree trunk on the right. And I'm working on the left hand side of this tree trunk first. So again, you may not feel like you need to do this step if you're already happy with how yours is looking. I just wanted to add a few more shadows. Mine didn't even really need it. I could have left it how it was and it would still have looked absolutely fine. I'm not going to add too much shadow using the black. I still want a lot of the colours to peep through and I want it to look really nice and vibrant. Once again, you can mix in a bit of purple into the black paint so that it still looks a bit more colourful. And I'm basically doing the same thing that I did with the pen, just with thicker lines. I'm going in and I'm adding some more sketchy details to give a rougher look to the tree trunk. And I'm going to repeat this process throughout all of the tree trunks. I'm also adding a little bit of shadow in the background just around these couple of leaves because in the reference this area was really dark, so I wanted to give a little bit of a contrast between those leaves that are overlapping onto the koala and the background. So you can use dark green for this. I'm adding a little bit of foliage further up from that section. And I'm adding a bit more brighter green. Next, I want to go in and add in a couple of highlights, and I'm going to be using white gouache for this. I'm using the Winsor & Newton permanent white gouache. So I've just squeezed a little bit onto my palette. I'm just mixing in a bit of water with my brush, not too much water, otherwise it won't be bright enough. Again, this is a step that you can miss out if you've already preserved all of your highlights and there's no areas that you feel you need to make brighter. But I'm going to use this to make my brightest highlights a little bit brighter, so that the painting pops even more. So I'm using it to add in a little bit of detail just above the nose. You can also use the gouache to add in little details like little fur strokes if you want to. You can use it to add highlights to the tree trunks as well as the koala, and even some little highlights to the foliage as well. Once again, if you do want a more loose and expressive style, be very careful when you use the gouache because you don't want to cover up all of the cool watercolour effects that you have achieved. So be really careful that you don't overdo it with the gouache. Once again, I'm starting off by adding in the highlights for the koala. I worked on the face first, and now I'm going in and adding in some highlights to the lower portion of the koala's arm. I'm also going to neaten up the shape of the koala's leg and add in a little bit of fur detailing. And on the foot as well. I'm also going to add some light, long strokes with my white gouache for the long fur on the ear. And I'm looking at the direction in which the fur is curving in. To make sure that it looks realistic and accurate to the reference image. I'm also going to add a little bit of highlight just above the eye, just brighten up that area. Now at this stage, I'm just adding in any little last highlights and details to the koala, and then I'll move on to adding some highlights to the tree trunks. Another thing that I love to do with gouache is add in some white splatters. So I'm just going to tap on the back of my brush just to get some twinkly white splatters. And I'm first just adding that where the koala is. Next, I'm going to start to add in some highlight throughout the tree trunks. This is a great way to also add in some more texture and to give it more of a rough look to it. I'm starting off with the branch on the bottom. And another thing to bear in mind is that gouache does tend to dry darker or more transparent than it is when it's wet. So you may think that the white gouache is going to be really opaque, but if you mix in a lot of water, it may look bright white when it's wet, but the more water that's mixed in, the more translucent it's going to dry. So you may have to go over and do multiple layers of this if you're finding it hard to get white enough. So if you're finding that your highlights aren't as white as you want them to be, then next time mix in less water into your gouache. I'm also adding a few little bits of foliage onto the background. Just makes it look a little more interesting. And I'm going to add in some highlights to the tree trunks now. Again, going in at strokes that go vertically with the tree trunk. I'm just repeating the same process as I did with the watercolours, this time just using white gouache, and this time only applying this paint to the brightest areas of each of the tree trunks. Looking at the reference and seeing where else I want to add some highlights. And I'm just going to repeat this process for all of the tree trunks and add in a bit more foliage to the background, and then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next part. So as well as adding in little splatters over the koala, I'm going to take my brush, load it up with gouache, and also add some more splatters now over the tree trunk and over the background, just like we did when we added the splatters over the top of the koala. I'm going in again and doing a few more. You don't want to go overboard, but you can do quite a few if you'd like to. And then once again, I'm just going back in and adding some highlights to this other main tree trunk. And so that is pretty much it for this painting. I really hope you guys enjoyed following along with this painting tutorial and you really like how yours turned out. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next tutorial series. Bye everybody.